Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Dear students, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the course of Academic Reading and Writing. Dear students, the topic of today's lecture is critical reading for academic purposes. I'm your teacher Muhammad Asif Khan, lecturer, Department of English, Kohat University of Science and Technology. Dear students, for today's class, agenda of discussion is that first of all, I will introduce the term reading and we will discuss that what is reading. Then we will differentiate between day-to-day reading and academic reading. After that, we will analyze this very thing that why academic reading is necessary and what is critical thinking. So these questions are very much interlinked and they are connected with one another. As we studied in the first lecture that what is critical thinking, now we are going to analyze this very thing that what is critical reading and how a student or any person can become a critical reader. So we will further explore another concept, and that is the difference between critical reading and critical thinking. We will also try to break down the concepts of critical reading versus creative reading. So these are the basic topics which we will cover in this lecture, and we will start with the definition of reading. So the question is, what is reading? Reading is a skill, or it is that ability of an individual to read text, and after reading or decoding that very text, if that very reader has the ability to comprehend the idea that was encoded by the speaker of that message, and in the end, if that very recipient of the message or the receiver of the message or the reader of that message has the ability to interpret those written words that are there on a page of article or any other reading material, that is a reading skill, or that is the ability of reading of an individual. So basically it is a cognitive process that involves decoding symbols, and the aim behind this decoding of symbol is to arrive at meanings. Second definition, we can also define this very term as a skill or an ability of a person to decode written language and text. What is reading skill? It is an ability of a person to decode written language and text. And the aim behind that decoding is to comprehend and interpret its meanings. So by decoding the message, actually we are trying to comprehend and interpret the meanings that are encoded or translated into that very message. So that is basically reading. Reading is a cognitive process that is going on in the mind, and it involves decoding of or reading of the symbols, and the aim is to arrive at meanings. Now let's move towards academic reading. What is academic reading? It is basically reading with a specific academic and educational purpose. So what is academic reading? It is defined as that type of reading which has some specific, special academic and educational purpose. So if we are doing academic reading, then it includes reading of more or less traditional books, like we can say the textbooks of any subject, or the dictionaries, encyclopedias and journals and journal articles, along with the many other resources. And in the present world we see that all the available resources that are available online, when we use those very resources for the understanding of the material, that is there in the school and colleges or other academic purposes, when we are trying to use these resources to understand that academic text, then actually we are doing academic reading. Academic reading is not a simple reading, it involves layers, and we see that what type of layers are there in academic reading. Like we include asking questions, or we can say that academic reading involves reflecting on relationship between the different parts of a text. It means that when you are trying to read a text, you are not only reading that very text, you are trying to reflect on or trying to think on the relationship between the different parts of that very text. And as always, we see that interpretation of the meaning is the central goal of any reading, as we also see that in academic reading, we are trying to interpret meanings of that text. And in the end, it is a very important thing that when we are reading academically any piece of text, actually we are making connections with other readings. For example, if we are studying any piece of literature, we have to identify its connections with any other material that is of the same genre. So these things are involved in academic reading and writing. Now let's move towards another question, that why we read any text academically. So reading is the most critical part of the learning process through which the students are going through. And we see that reading, most of the time, it appears to students to be very boring process, or it is that very task which is not that much interesting to the students. So reading is that important ability which is most critical in the learning process. If we are studying a text, we want to expand our knowledge, and we are not ready to analyze any text according to the standards of academic reading. So it means we are lacking in our learning process. But it is very necessary. And if we want to improve our ideas about any topic, reading is that very ability which helps us to expand our perspective. So our ideas about research will most of the time come from reading. If we are not reading, it means that we are unable to identify the different problems that are there in that very academic subject which we are studying. So reading is that very ability which provides us that very information from which we can enhance, from which we can go forward in our research. So it helps us to expand our perspectives. Therefore, we are reading academically. Now let's move towards the question which we analyzed or which we studied in the last lecture. But here I am not giving you the definitions from John Dewey or Glaser. I am simply defining this very term, that what is critical thinking. So basically it is questioning, analyzing, or challenging assumptions, and it is something that is like forming independent judgments. For example, if we come across any statement, any belief, any assumed form of knowledge, so basically we have to question that very thing, and we have to analyze that very thing in such a way that we challenge the assumptions that are there. And by challenging those assumptions, actually we move toward that way where we form our independent judgments. So it is not a passive process, it is very much active process, And we see that in this process, the reader or the critical thinker, he is challenging the assumptions or challenging the beliefs or challenging the assumed form of knowledge. So questioning that very thing, questioning beliefs and knowledge that is already available to us, that is something which is under the term critical thinking. So why we think critically? Actually, we need to step into the academic debate. Specifically, when we are academically reading something or studying something, or we are in academic debate, critical thinking is that process which enables us to get into that academic debate. And it makes us able to evaluate different ideas. So to make your own evaluations of how much you are willing to accept the ideas you are reading, that is in the domain of critical thinking. So rather than blindly accepting any belief or any statement, critical thinking is instigating the scholars to question that very thing. So that is critical thinking, and it is very important in academic reading and writing, which is basically very important for learning process. Now let's move forward towards another question, and that is, what is critical reading? Critical reading is a more active way of reading. It is not simple passive way of reading or reading for the sake of enjoyment or entertainment. It is active way of reading. So how it is active way of reading? It is active in this sense that it is a deeper and more complex engagement with the text. Critical reading is that process in which we analyze and interpret the text that is available to us. And sometimes we evaluate as a critical thinker the details and the information and ideas and beliefs that are there in that very text. So critical reading is a process of analyzing, interpreting, and sometimes evaluating that piece of text. And another question arrives in the mind, that when do we use this very skill of critical reading? The answer is that we use our critical thinking skill to question both text and our own reading of that. There are two things. On the one side, we have a text that has a message. On the other hand, we see that when we are reading that text, some ideas comes to our mind, generates in our mind. And these two things are they're parallel. They're in parallel. And a critical reader questions both the text and the reader's own ideas that are coming in his mind. So it is a very dynamic reading, and it is an active process in which we see that there is a complex engagement with a text. So this is critical reading. And how do we become a critical reader? That is also a very important phenomena when we study for academic purposes. We see that when we are reading a text, the most important thing for a critical reader is to consider the title of that very text. And after that, it is important that he should think about that what type of information is already there in his mind about that very topic that is there in the title of that text. So it helps to connect the reader to the background information. And it also helps the reader to think about that what else the reader needs to know about that very topic. So this very process initiates another thing in the mind of reader, and that is that he or she becomes interested about that very topic. Another important thing is that how we can become a critical reader, and that is that we should look at how the text is structured. It is very important that we should look at the subdivisions of that text, and we should consider that how many chapters or acts are there in that very piece of text. So it helps us to understand the text structure, and when a reader identifies the text structure, it becomes very easy for him to grasp the main idea or the discussion that is going on in this very text. So after identifying the text structure and looking at the subdivisions or chapters of that very text, then comes another important step that is very important for a critical reader, and that is to skim the opening sentences of each paragraph. And it will give you the basic hints about the overall discussion of that very text. If you are able to skim the opening sentences of each paragraph, we know that the first one or two sentences of each paragraph that provides you the central idea of that very paragraph, and in this way you can skim the overall idea of that very discussion. Another important step to become a critical reader is that a reader should read carefully, and he should mark or highlight all the confusing parts of that text, and he should consult the dictionary or any other helpful resource that he thinks that it would be helpful for him. He should consult that very thing. And after that, identifying the key issues or the key arguments along with important terms and interesting ideas is very important. If a reader marks those very ideas, assumptions, issues, then it becomes very easy for him to move ahead in that very reading. After that, you may take notes in the margin, or if you are maintaining a special reading journal or a register for that very thing, and then it will be very helpful for you when you will again read that very text in a more critical way. And questioning the sources is very important. After that, your personal experiences or the different research that are being done about on that very title is very important, and your imagination also helps you to analyze that very piece more critically. What questions would you like to ask the author? It is very important part. We see that a written message is that very message in which most of the time the author or the sender of that message is not present. So when we are reading a text as a critical reader, it is very important that we should think about that text as if someone is talking to us, and if any question arises in our mind, we should note down that very question, and we should take it as if we meet that very author somewhere. We would like to these very questions from him or her. So that is again very important strategy, to list down all the questions that arises in your mind about that very text. So it will be very helpful for better understanding of that text, and this is the strategy most of the time being used by the critical readers. So very important to think about the work as a whole, that what is the overall message of this text. So not only skimming the basic ideas or getting gist of that whole text, it is very important to establish the overall idea or the message of that text. It will be very helpful. For example, if we summarize all the main details of that text, it will be like a critical reader, and it will be very beneficial incomplete understanding of the text. Another step to become a critical reader is that you as a reader analyze this very thing, that did you get what you expected as you read the title, that when you read the title of that very piece of text, you predicted about the text. Now in the end you have to analyze this very thing, that did you get what you expected or predicted about this very piece of writing. That will be very helpful for you to critically reading that piece of information. So these are some of the important steps to become a critical reader. Critical reading is very close to critical thinking, and we see that critical reading is basically a technique for identifying or discovering the information and ideas that are present in a piece of text. And critical thinking is another technique, and it is that technique in which we evaluate information and ideas. And the most important part in critical thinking is that we evaluate the information and ideas for deciding what to accept and believe. As I already told you that critical thinking is that very technique in which we make evaluations, that how much we are willing to accept what we are reading. And it is basically challenging assumptions, and it is something like establishing our own independent judgments. So it is very different from blindly accepting any piece of information or idea. So when we are critically thinking, we are not blindly following the things. We are not blindly accepting the things. We evaluate information and ideas, and then we decide that what we should accept and what we should believe. Whereas critical reading is a technique in which we are just discovering the information and ideas within the text. And critical thinking is one step ahead of that. And in this, we have to decide that what we should believe and what we should leave aside. So critical reading and critical thinking, basically these two techniques work together. And first we have to read critically, and then we have to think critically about that very piece of information or ideas. So that is the difference between critical reading and critical thinking. Now let's analyze two other terms side by side, and these two terms are critical reading versus creative reading. Dear students, critical thinking is when you think analytically, judgmentally. From analytically, I mean judgmentally, selectively, and we make choices. What we are doing, we are logically, systematically, or rationally thinking about anything. And when we are considering any idea or any belief logically, systematically, rationally, after that we make judgments, we make choices, whether it is worthy to believe or accept, or it is something which we should put aside. So that is critical thinking. Whereas creative thinking is that thinking when an individual thinks generatively. It is very different from critical thinking. We are most of the time uncritically doing creative thinking. It does not mean that when we are doing creative thinking, it is completely uncritical, but actually we are generating new ideas. So when we generate new ideas, then we are doing creative thinking. So creative thinking is a little bit different from critical thinking. In critical thinking, we already have ideas. We just analyze those very ideas, or we judge those very ideas, or we do selections about, or we make choices about the ideas, that whether these ideas are acceptable or unacceptable. In creative thinking, The most important thing is to generate new ideas. In creative thinking, we are thinking generatively, uncritically, or expansively. And the idea behind creative thinking is to generate new ideas. So that is the difference between critical versus creative thinking. So dear students, in today's lecture we have studied the definition of reading, and I defined the term reading to you, that it is basically an ability of an individual to decode symbols, written symbols, or to read written symbols. And after reading those very symbols, a process starts in our mind that is basically a cognitive process, and we after that comprehend the ideas that are there in that very text. And another important thing about reading skill is to create that very ability in the reader, and that ability is to interpret those written words that are there in that very text or in that article or any reading material that is with us. So reading is the ability to decode ideas and afterward to comprehend and to interpret its meanings. Academic reading is different from normal reading, because here the purpose of reading is to read specifically for academic and educational purposes. So academic reading involves different layers, and in this process we see that reader is asking questions and he is reflecting on the relationship of different parts of the text, and he is trying to interpret the meanings and making connection with other readings. So we do academic reading because it is the most critical part of the learning process. Critical thinking is a little bit different from that, because in critical thinking we are questioning, we are analyzing and challenging assumptions. And when we challenge assumptions, we form independent judgments. So it is different from the questioning that we do in the academic reading, because there we just ask questions and establish relationship between the different parts of the text. But here we are deciding and forming independent judgments. So critical reading helps us to evaluate things, and rather than blindly following any belief or assumed form of knowledge, we try to question and analyze that very information or belief. Critical reading is more active way of reading, and again here we are analyzing, but it is simply for interpreting the ideas that are there in the text. We are not judgmental about those very ideas. To become a critical reader, considering the title, thinking about the background knowledge that is already there in your mind, and then analyzing the text structure, skimming all the opening sentences of each paragraph is very important to become a critical reader. Then marking and highlighting the confusing parts and the key issues and arguments in that very text is very important. And making notes or writing notes in the margin lines, that is very important. And questioning the sources is again important step to become a critical reader. Thinking about the overall impact of that very writing is very important, and just questioning that very thing, that whether this text has fulfilled the expectations which you predicted in the beginning of this reading. Critical reading and critical thinking are techniques, and we see that critical reading is that technique which is basically for discovering information within the text, and critical thinking is something more than that. And in this process we evaluate information and ideas for deciding what to accept and what to believe. So these two processes work together, And we see that first of all we read critically and then we think critically. Critical thinking is when you think analytically or judgmentally, and we are basically making choices. On the other hand, creative writing is something where we generate new ideas. So that is the difference between critical thinking and creative thinking. So dear students, I'm ending my discussion here, and I hope that now you will be clear about the critical reading for academic purposes, and in the next lecture I will give you further explanation of these concepts. Allah Hafiz.